Welcome everyone. For those who are just joining us, we're about to commence. So today we are discussing water markets and transparency, looking at where we're at and where we're heading. So I'd like to begin today with an acknowledgement of country. At RBMS, we acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples and original custodians of Australia's land and waters, and honour their elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and respect the continuing deep spiritual connection that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have to country and their unique ability to care for country. And today I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people from which the land on which I'm calling on. So just a bit of background for the River Basin Management Society on who we are. We are a diverse community of practice in Australia, and we're dedicated to connecting people and sharing knowledge in integrated catchment management. We're an elected volunteer committee, and we are supported by our members across Victoria, New South Wales and South East Queensland, and hopefully soon Tasmania. If you want to find out more about the RBMS, please head to the website at www.rbms.com.au. So for today's session, we have your hosts. So my name is Janice Taylor. I'm the Victorian chapter lead. We have Jessica Walker, our Vice President, as the panel chair. And we have Genevieve Smith working our technical lead, and as well as Christian Borovic. Today's guest speakers and panel are Dr. Erin O'Donnell. She'll be speaking about Australia's water markets, the good, the bad, and the opportunities to be better. Then we'll hear from Ben Williams, and he'll talk about water market transparency with a view from the ground. After the presentations, we'll be joined by Chris Olzak from Aether Economics and Jeremy Chessman from Marsden Jacob Associates. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. All attendees will be on mute for the duration. To ask a question, can you please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen and not the chat or raise hand function. As part of the questions that you can submit, you can also upvote. So if there's a question, instead of replicating that, you can upvote that question to put it up to the top of the list. And all questions that are asked in this whole session will be responded to by the Q&A panel, but anything at the end that is unanswered, we will take offline, and we will aim to have those answered and sent out with a recording of this webinar. So I want to hand over to our chair, Jess, who will introduce our first presenter.
Hi, hello everybody. My name is Jess Walker. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which I am sitting today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, and acknowledge their continuing connection to the land. I would like to introduce our first speaker. So we're really excited for this panel today. We've got 4 fantastic speakers. We'll have 2 presenters, as Janice mentioned, and then we'll bring in 2 more people to make it sort of a well-rounded panel. Our first presenter is Dr. Erin O'Donnell. And Erin is a water law and policy specialist with almost 2 decades of experience in water governance and water markets. She's completed 2 consultancies for the World Bank, including a global review of water markets and their role in water security and sustainable development. Currently, Erin is a research fellow at the University of Melbourne, where she is partnering with the Murray and Lower Darling Indigenous nations to develop water law and policy pathways for Aboriginal people to increase access to water rights. And Erin will be presenting on Australia's water markets, the good, the bad, and the opportunities to be better. Once Erin is presented, we'll move straight over to Ben Williams. And Ben is a water broker with Rural Co, water based in Adelaide. He spent much of his childhood on the Murray River, and literally on the Murray River, as he was water skiing at a friend's family wheat and sheep farm near Bow Hill. He's in his 2nd year of serving as the president of the Australian Water Brokers Association, and he also sits on the South Australian Department of Environment and Water's Central Adelaide Plains Water Allocation Plan Committee. So I'll hand straight over to you, Erin, if you're able to share your screen.
Fantastic. All right, sorry, just sorting that out. waiting for it to happen. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. All right, that I think has now worked. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about a bit of an overview of where Australia's water markets are currently and some of the opportunities that I see for making water markets work better for all of us. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Eastern Maar country. I'm down in Melbourne, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And I would also like to pay my respects particularly to any Indigenous people who are joining us here today. Yeah, I think I'll just leave that there. So, to get to the presentation, I think there's a lot that Australian water markets are doing well, and sometimes it's easy to lose sight of that. But when we take a bit of a global overview, we can start to see some of these broad trends that we're actually doing quite effectively. Yeah, excellent. So, where I wanted to start with was what makes a good water market and why are Australia's water markets actually functioning quite well already? And I think we can start to think about this by considering these water fundamentals. So back in 2005, Poling Tan came up with what I still think are some of the best and most straightforward ways of describing what makes a functional market. What are these elements that we need to actually make it work? So the first one is many buyers and sellers, and correspondingly, many actual trades. And this gets to the heart of what markets are actually designed to do, facilitate the exchange of access to a resource like water and to reveal information about how valuable that resource actually is. And to do that, you need a lot of people participating. The second one is mobile resources. So water, as we know, is particularly heavy. There's been a lot of challenges over the past year or so getting water where it needs to be in our water markets. But generally, what we're actually transferring is the right to use it. And most water sits in a very small number of storages, and so it's fairly easy to do that initial transfer, even though we've certainly seen some challenges when it comes to delivery of late. So that's probably one that we'll come back to when we start thinking about maybe there's some of the opportunities to improve. The third point is reliable and adequate information. So this is something that Australia has done extremely well, again in a global context. I think we're all here today to talk about the idea of water market transparency and how we get better at sharing that information. But if you look across the board, Australia tends to provide fairly high quality information about water market prices. It's fairly easy to access. It's fairly easy to see how many trades have actually happened. That information is largely in the public domain. Finally, we have well-defined and largely homogeneous water rights. These are also really important because, firstly, well-defined, you need to know what it is that you're actually buying and selling. And then this question of homogeneous. And by that, I mean that we have a fairly small number of similar water rights. So if you're in Northern Victoria and you're buying a high reliability water share, then high reliability water shares in that same river system are fairly similar to what you have. It's very easy to figure out, okay, what are other people buying and selling? And is that the same as what I have, or is it the same as what I want? So again, trying to figure out what's an appropriate price to place on the water that you're trying to buy and sell depends on just how many different kinds there are. And in other parts of the world, there can be an almost infinite number of different types of entitlements depending on different types of security or different physical locations in the system. So Australia has, by and large, achieved a lot of these fundamentals in particularly the southern connected Murray-Darling Basin water market. And some of the reasons for that relate to history. So we've had a history of fairly small developments in that region. So there were lots of people there accessing water, which led to the potential many buyers and sellers. This is a particular issue in Australia. Water rights are not exactly property rights. So we treat them a lot like property. We can transfer them, we can buy and sell them, we can mortgage them, but they're not protected in quite the same way as property. And that means that we can alter the rules. And our ability to do that has meant that we've been able to construct a water market that is more designed to meet our needs. And finally, government investment. This has been the big kicker for Australian water markets, is government investment in the processes that underpin the market itself. And this includes things from water registers and actually maintaining that publicly available information through to compliance and enforcement. And this is again something that we're starting to see being quite divergent in the south of the Murray-Darling Basin compared to the north of the Murray-Darling Basin, where compliance and enforcement has a few more challenges. But that government investment is one of the things that has made Australian water markets work as well as they have. So in a global context, that's generally what we're doing quite well. Still pretty good. Transaction costs. So these are all the costs that go into a trade of water that aren't actually the price of the water. And again, we're fairly low when it comes to transaction costs. So a 2018 study showed that it took about 8 hours on average for an individual to figure out how to complete the trade. So it's like a lot in some ways, but on the other hand, it's actually quite small in terms of what we're seeing from other countries. Trades are processed in days in the Murray-Darling Basin, sometimes even quicker. So this again shows a functional water market. Sustainability and human rights to water. So this is where we're starting to get into the slightly more grey areas. But again, Australia has minimum flows protection for the environment. There are environmental entitlements. We have just seen one of the world's largest environmental water recovery processes. Whether it's actually enough is another question, but there is certainly a commitment towards sustainable water management, and that's embedded in our legal frameworks that underpin the water market. We also have embedded in there the critical human needs protections. Now, I think there's a great deal of debate about what constitutes a critical human need, and we're certainly not doing as well as we could be about meeting all of them, but they are embedded within our market processes. But why are things so hard? Why has this drought been different? Why are water markets the source of a lot of angst and the focus of a lot of people's fears and the pain that we're seeing across particularly the New South Wales Murray-Darling Basin over the past few years? There's a few different reasons. I pulled these couple of graphs from the AITHA 2019 report, and it looks at the issue of water use intensification. So why is this drought so different, say, to the drought that was 2007 to 2010? And we've seen a shift in the way that water is used. We've seen increases in permanent plantings, and they need water every single year. So as we increase permanent plantings, the flexibility that we have to move water around starts to decrease. And one of the interesting graphs I pulled out from that AITHA report starts to look at how much of the available water in the future permanent plantings could actually absorb in a really dry year. And that last little point on that graph is an extreme dry year similar to 2007, 2008. And you can see that projected permanent horticultural water demand actually is almost all of that available water. So there's a reasonably good reason why we've started to see increased competition and significantly increased prices during this drought. That's been, I think, exacerbated by the closure of intervalley trade and the lack of inflows to the River Murray downstream of the Barmah Choke. So all of South Australia's demand has had to be met from Murray storages, whereas in the past, some of that might have come through from the Darling. We're starting to see, with flows coming down the Darling once again, that that's now starting to open up and bring a little bit more flexibility back into the system. So we had a few confounding events that all happened at the same time. Fundamentally, what really happened was that we had extreme water scarcity and extremely high demand. And in those kinds of situations, you will get extremely high water prices. And that's what that top graph on this slide shows. So what are the problems going forward? We've talked about the good, we've talked about the challenges posed by this drought. And now I want to really start focusing on, this is kind of the bad, the things that we're not doing well currently, and that we really need to focus on for the future. The big elephant in the room is always climate change. So we're starting to see the impacts of climate change already. Every projection says that water scarcity is likely to get worse, temperatures are going to increase, variability is going to increase. So we'll see more years with intense drought, and we'll see possibly some flash flood events as well. So variability, the major driver of water prices is water scarcity. So as variability increases, water scarcity gets worse, we'll likely see both increased water prices and increased price volatility. So that's kind of my projection of where the market is headed under current circumstances into a climate change future. Problem number 2 is policy confusion. There are a lot of overlapping regulations across the Murray-Darling Basin. Every state runs its own water register. The water market operates kind of across the top, but it's incredibly diversified in terms of the state and federal responsibilities. And we've also got a bunch of different reviews. So I feel like we're in review fatigue right now. We've just had another one get launched by the Productivity Commission, which was always part of the plan, but just feels like another ongoing process. I think the question that I want to get to with the policy confusion is that we need to see markets as a form of regulation. They're not an alternative to regulation. They're a way that we can manage collective access to water resources. So I think there's a tendency to focus on the markets simply as markets. Can we make them work as a functional market, and is that enough? What I'm seeing in these policy reviews and in feedback from regional Victoria is that that's not enough. A functional market on its own is not going to deliver the kind of outcomes that we want for water management across Victoria. It's almost certainly part of the process, and water markets deliver fantastic outcomes under certain circumstances. But we need to be open to this question of how do we make sure that the market is actually delivering the outcomes that we want? Not necessarily in terms of who individually should receive water rights or which industries we want to favour over others, but generally, is the market actually delivering on our vision for rural and regional Australia? And I think despite a number of different reviews here, the Sefton report, the Keelty report, the forthcoming ACCC review, we still don't really have clarity of vision when it comes to rural and regional Australia. Problem number 3, this gets to the heart of what markets do. They reallocate water between users. So the origins of water markets in Australia really came down to the fact that we needed to place a cap on total water use, and we wanted to enable water to move to different uses in the future. So transfers and trades enable that to happen without breaching the cap and imposing all kinds of other problems. So markets are designed to reallocate water, but there are 3 specific kinds of water reallocation that will need to happen as we go forward. Firstly, there's the rural to urban water transfer. So I should say here, I'm not necessarily a proponent of that, but that is an increasing pressure I'm seeing around the world. Cities can generally pay higher prices for water than country users can, and so as cities grow, as water scarcity begins to bite, there is that pressure to transfer water. So a market that actually engages with that issue is going to be important. Otherwise, you get it happening around the edges of the market, and that's no good for anyone either. The second issue is consumptive to environment. Now, I talked about one of the world's biggest environmental water recovery programs, and we certainly have recovered a lot of water for the environment, but we know it's not enough. We know that. It's still below what the original Murray-Darling Basin Plan requirements were. We're looking at some challenges to even achieve those legislated outcomes. So we know that this is a challenge. There's been another push recently to try and transfer water from consumptive users to the environment as one of the cheapest and easiest ways to increase environmental entitlements. It can be those things, but the process by which that happens needs to be really carefully thought through. And again, at the moment, the market is not necessarily delivering on that to the extent that it could. Thirdly, and most importantly, is the question of water justice. So across the board, Aboriginal Australians own less than 0.1% of water entitlements in Australia. In New South Wales, some really cutting-edge research by Lana Hartwig has shown that Aboriginal Australians in New South Wales constitute about 10% of the population. In New South Wales, they own 0.2% of the water. And there's a number of waves of dispossession that has happened, and I think we need to acknowledge our history. Markets are great at reallocating water between those who already have access to it. But where history has excluded a particular group of people, like traditional owners, First Nations people, then that becomes a real barrier to entry for them to get into the market in the first place. So again, we know that traditional owners are asserting their rights to water, they never ceded their rights to water, and there is a push to reallocate. Big push going on in Victoria right now, and it's acknowledged in a number of other states as well. So the final problem area that I wanted to talk briefly about is this issue of market operation. So for all that we're doing lots of really good things, and globally Australia's water markets are operating quite effectively, there is a real unevenness of the way that the water markets are operating and the way that rules and regulation are operating, both within the MDB and outside the MDB. So there's been a really interesting paper that's just come out from Sarah Wheeler at the University of Adelaide that's looking at the difference between the north of the basin and the south of the basin. The markets operate very differently, rules and regulation are very different, water rights are quite different, compliance and enforcement issues are very different. So that unevenness creates challenges. There is a lack of real-time price availability. Now, there's lots of things underway to make that better, but I think we're still grappling with how we can actually do that, how we do that in a context where each state is still kind of doing its own thing. Compliance and enforcement, big issue. I think when it comes to market operation, what drives markets is the property rights around the water entitlement, knowing that you're only allowed to take what you're officially specified on your water entitlement. But if compliance and enforcement are a bit lax, then why would you bother to go and buy water? Maybe you'll just risk it and see if you get a fine. I think we've seen some of that attitude come through, particularly in traders in New South Wales. Transparency and arm's length trading. So this is a really important issue. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail because I think Ben's going to cover off on some of this in his presentation next. But the importance for people to be able to know that the water brokers that they're going to are engaging with the market at arm's length, that it's not for personal profit, that's incredibly important. And that kind of leads me into this potential for corruption and political influence. So when market prices are very high, I think we see a lot of people experiencing some fairly significant economic and financial pain, and that can create some political influence, or certainly the desire to influence political outcomes. And some of the conversations that we've seen happen in the Murray-Darling Basin around water market operation have pointed to things that have been a little bit suspect. I think it's, from that perspective, it's quite heartening to see the ACCC review, because they will be focused very much on this question of market operation, and they will be coming at it from that expert perspective. So the two final points I wanted to make here relate to things that I said we were generally doing okay on: sustainability and human needs. So globally, yep, our formal market arrangements do pick up on both of these things, but we need to get better at it. We've certainly seen sustainability impose significant constraints both on water quality and on getting water to where it needs to go. And we've seen communities run out of water. We've seen communities struggle to get water of a safe drinking standard, particularly Indigenous communities across rural Australia. So our market operation needs to do better at reflecting those boundaries that we are trying to impose to say, well, there has to be a certain minimum standard for everyone. So this is my final slide. These are the opportunities that I think we have to do better. And I've linked these specifically to Sustainable Development Goal 6, which relates to water. So we've got 10 years to try and think about how we're going to actually achieve the Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN across the world. And these are the issues that I think we need to be really thinking about in terms of what our water markets are actually delivering. Is water safe, affordable, and accessible? And the critical questions here, I think, are for who and what actually do we mean by affordable in a commercial setting? So there would be many people out there saying, well, water market prices now are way too high. It's not affordable. So I think we need to be able to have those conversations. Water justice is a critical one. What does water justice actually look like for Indigenous peoples across Australia? How do we facilitate the achievement of water justice? It's bigger than the handover of water rights, although I feel like that is going to be a very important step in that direction. Healthy water ecosystems, how do we actually make sure that our water is getting to the right places at the right times to maintain our healthy working rivers and wetlands? having a healthy functioning ecosystem is the critical component to all of our water use and water delivery. So we need to maintain it. Efficient allocation and use. This is something that water markets have been designed to do. They move water to its highest value use, which can also be code for who can pay the most. But there is this question of, well, if it's moving it to its highest value use, is that not efficient? And it can be, except during extreme water scarcity, when resilience and flexibility become almost as important as the value that you're able to generate by the use of that water. So how do we encourage innovation but manage the pain of droughts? How do we retain enough flexibility in the system so that there are people who are, able to sell water to others during droughts? And lastly, but in no way least, is appropriate regulation. Again, we need to remember that markets are what we design them to be. So we need the regulatory tools that enable them to both operate as markets, and markets always require a rule framework to make sure that people are actually following the rules and enabling the market to operate, and that we're setting those regulatory rules to get the kind of outcomes that we actually want. So that's it for me. I'm now going to hand over to Ben.
Thanks, Erin. And just before you start, Ben, I'd just like to encourage people, we do have the question and answer function. So as the presentations are going through, feel free to pop questions in there and upvote.